We go live now to London, UK, where the British Minister for Women and Equalities, Bridget Phillips, is giving a statement on the recent Supreme Court ruling on the definition of woman.
If we're going to see legislation to do that, because we must remember that what we're dealing with here is not some hypothetical, it's real lives, real fears, real concerns amongst the LGBT community. Because equality and human rights should never be the
Order. Minister.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. As she says, I know that she has written to me on this topic. I will be happy to meet with her, or a member of the ministerial team will be happy to meet with her to discuss this further. Where we can agree is that dignity and respect should be for all within our country. That is for women and for trans people too. And trans people should not face discrimination or harassment on the basis of who they are. But I believe it is entirely compatible to ensure that we have a society that treats everyone with dignity and respect, whilst ensuring that single-sex spaces can continue to exist for biological women who require that safety and dignity, particularly following periods of terrible abuse. And I think it is also important that, of course, there are services that are available for trans people in addition. And often it's the case that some of those services are much better provided by those with the specialist knowledge and expertise in order to deliver that provision. I agree this should not be seen as being a conflict. And the ruling from the Supreme Court, whilst being clear about the importance of biological sex, was also at pains to stress that trans people do retain clear protections within law and should be able to live their lives free of harassment and discrimination.
Catherine Fuchs.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've already been contacted by several different LGBTQ+ and trans organisations in Monmouthshire, my constituency, who are really concerned and frightened about the potential implications of this judgment. Will the Minister commit to meeting with trans people from my constituency, such as Queer Space, Abergavenny Pride and Monmouth Pride, to hear their concerns about the potential impact of this ruling?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I do note my honourable friend's concern, and I can assure her that I will continue to meet with a range of stakeholders in this important area, because I agree with her that no one should face prejudice or discrimination because of who they are, and that's why we're working with the Home Office to deliver our commitment to equalise all existing strands of hate crime, to make them aggravated offences. We will work right across this House to ensure that whilst we maintain single-sex spaces for biological women, we ensure that trans people have the support and the respect that they deserve, including access to healthcare services.
Shivani Raja.
Will the Secretary of State confirm whether she will take action? Will she take action to ensure policies and lessons in schools are not led by external organisations that are captured by contested gender ideology?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I set out in my response to the Leader of the Opposition, we will publish revised guidance where it comes to RSHE. I think it is an important principle that parents understand what is being taught to their children within their children's school, and we will ensure that that is maintained.
Emily Thornbury.
Very much, Madam Speaker. Over the last few days, calls to Switchboard, the national LGBT+ helpline in my constituency, has skyrocketed. The callers who are in fear for what this ruling means to them. Because trans people, frightened to use public loos today, know one thing. And does the Secretary of State agree? We should all be clear about this. The overwhelming threat to women and to all of the trans community is the violence that we suffer from cis men.
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree that male violence remains a very serious challenge that we face as a country, a challenge that this Labour government is determined to confront. But I would say to her that the ruling of the Supreme Court was clear about the importance of biological sex, but I would not want any trans person in her constituency or anywhere across the country to be fearful. I believe that everyone has the right to be treated with dignity and respect, not to face discrimination or harassment, and that is why we will back the police to ensure that action is taken against anyone who behaves in that way.
Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd be grateful if the Secretary of State could focus on her government and the future implications of this.
she said NHS England will soon publish guidance on how trans patients should be accommodated in clinical settings. And if I can read to her what the Worcestershire Acute Hospital Trust has in its guidance currently, it says patients should always be treated as the gender they identify as, regardless of what their transition looks like or how long they have shared their identity with others. Patients should always be in an environment that aligns with their gender identity. Would she say to Worcestershire Acute Hospital Trust that they need to actually act very quickly to change that guidance?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my colleagues and officials in the Department of Health and Social Care are in contact with NHS England to ensure that guidance is set out rapidly to give the clarity that is required arising out of the Supreme Court judgment. And if the Right Honourable Lady would share with me the details that she's just read out there, I would happily make sure that that is investigated further.
Preet Gill. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the ruling from the Supreme Court and the Minister's statement. The Supreme Court has been clear that Sex and Equality Act 2010 means biological sex. The question now turns to how we make sure that the Equality Act is properly understood and implemented. So can the Secretary of State state how she would ensure that public bodies, third sector organisations, sports bodies, regulated sectors and so on comply with the Act so women's safety, privacy and dignity is protected?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said, we'll work with the EHRC to provide further guidance to service providers, including through their update to the statutory code of practice. We expect the EHRC to do that as rapidly as possible, recognising that this is a thorough and detailed piece of work. But it is important that service providers arising from this ruling by the Supreme Court now have the clarity and confidence that was always there in the Equality Act 2010.
John Lamont.
Thank you very much. The Supreme Court's ruling goes a long way to guarantee the rights and safety of women and girls. But does the Minister agree with me that the judgment highlights why it's now right for the SNP government to finally ditch the divisive gender self-ID agenda once and for all, and proves it was totally wrong for Scottish Labour to back the SNP Gender Recognition Reform Bill?
My understanding, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that the Scottish Government do not intend to progress their gender recognition reforms. My officials will work with the EHRC, who will in turn also work with the Scottish Government. I believe Scottish ministers have indicated, Madam Deputy Speaker, that they wish to engage with the EHRC on this guidance, which is an important and welcome development.
Dame Meg Hillier. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to represent a constituency which shows tolerance to people from all backgrounds, and unlike the political hot potato this has become in this place and in political dialogue. I have a constituent who has been transitioned in the 1970s. She's used female toilets now for more of her life than she ever did any other toilets. Are we saying that her dignity and her respect that the Secretary of State has talked about is going to be any way improved if there is any ban on her using the toilets that she's been using for so many years? Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ruling from the Supreme Court made clear that the provision of single-sex spaces is on the basis of biological sex. But what I would say to my right honourable friend and to her constituent is that through the development of the code of practice that the EHRC will be setting out, they will make sure that businesses and others ensure that there is dignity and respect for all, that there is appropriate provision, including the use of toilet facilities, so that no one, including trans people, must feel unsafe when they use public toilets.
Sarah Dyke. Deputy Speaker, everyone must be able to access services with the dignity upheld and privacy respected, including women and trans people. But following the Supreme Court ruling, many people are feeling confused and concerned. We must not allow this to lead to further heated arguments and toxicity. So what steps is the Minister taking to develop the critical guidance needed to give businesses and public bodies clarity on how this ruling should be implemented so everyone is treated with the dignity that they deserve? Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we will work with the EHRC on that guidance. They will present a revised code of practice that I will review and will present in due course. It is important that they do that as quickly as possible, but as I say, this is a complex area that must be undertaken thoroughly, including engagement with a range of stakeholders, including businesses, for the reasons that the Honourable Lady identifies.
Charlotte Nichols.
verdict raises as many questions as it answers, and indeed has been referred to by the civil servant Melanie Field, who oversaw the Equality Act's drafting and passage, as having, quote, significantly reinterpreted Parliament's intentions. These questions are primarily about what the purpose of a gender recognition certificate is now, whether exclusion from single-sex spaces is merely lawful or required, but also in protecting women's spaces such as toilets from predatory men pretending to be trans women. What exactly stops those same men from now accessing them, pretending to be trans men?
Minister. Madam Deputy Speaker, I understand the concern that my honourable friend expresses and why she raises the question she does today in this House. But I do have to say to her that the position of this government is that the Supreme Court has provided clarity and confidence in this area, particularly where it comes to single-sex spaces being on the basis of biological sex, and the basis for that was the Equality Act that the last Labour government introduced.
Caroline Johnson.
Madam Speaker, I am pleased to get the clarity from the Supreme Court judgment. People on this side have always known what a woman is. The Right Honourable Lady says she's going to ensure that the government implements and ensures that the public services are fully compliant with the legislation, which is good. Could she clarify, she's talked about NHS single-sex wards and their provision for biological females and biological males. Could she confirm, does that mean that trans women will be cared for on male wards?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the basis for NHS provision and the basis for single-sex services of all kinds will be on the basis of biological sex.
Marsha de Clover.
Madam Can I firstly welcome and thank the Secretary of State for the measured way which she has delivered this statement, but also for her robust work on this issue. Last week's landmark Supreme Court judgment not only provided clarity, but some long overdue common sense. For too long, the issue has at times been toxic and has caused a great deal of harm to both women and trans people. So can I ask the Secretary of State to confirm to the House that her department is liaising with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission to seek assurances that they will work not only at pace but also to set some clear timelines in relation to updating the statutory guidance, and will she also ensure that any guidance that is now unlawful is withdrawn?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I can give my honourable friend the assurance that we will work as quickly as possible with the EHRC in this important area. I also think she is right to highlight the importance of good temper where it comes to different views on this topic, recognising that people have held strongly held views over a number of years, but where we do that, we respect one another, and that where we disagree, we do not descend into hate-filled rhetoric or involve ourselves in some of the unfortunate and deeply regrettable protests in terms of the nature of the defacement of statues and hate-filled rhetoric. Now is the opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, arising from the Supreme Court judgment, to draw a line under this, to make sure the right guidance is in place and to ensure that clarity is there for all.
Kirsty Blackman.
Speaker, I appreciate the Secretary of State's words around reducing the temperature on this. There are an awful lot of people who are hurting a huge amount this week as a result of the announcement that's been made, and I appreciate the commitment to reduce the temperature on that, and I hope that everybody would sign up to that. The SNP welcomes the clarity that's been offered on the definition in the Equality Act and notes the judgment's points of interaction between the 2010 and the 2004 Act. Also notes the commitment of the Secretary of State and the EHRC to deliver the guidance as quickly as possible on the new Code of Practice. I would like to ask the Secretary of State if and when she will be replying to the letter that was sent from the Scottish Government seeking a meeting with UK Government in early course, and I would urge her to undertake that meeting as soon as possible, please.
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would of course be happy to engage with colleagues from the Scottish Government. I'll respond to that letter as quickly as I can.
Cat Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very conscious that I represent many trans, intersex and non-binary constituents, and that the representations that I've had made to me in my office over the past few days has been a very clear message that they're feeling particularly victimised and quite scared for their own safety. Some are trans women and some are trans men who seem to be very much lost from this debate. But the one thing that really unites them is that they're worried about their day-to-day safety. So can I ask the Minister to provide some assurance to trans people right across the country that the Equality Act is still there and can protect them from discrimination and harassment?
Minister. Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. They retain protection from discrimination and harassment, and I can say very clearly to this House that trans people should not be treated, should not be victims of discrimination or harassment. They deserve dignity and respect, and that's why it is important that we also ensure that trans people have access to high quality healthcare services, and that we also clamp down on hate crimes, including those that are targeted at LGBT people.
Harriet Cross.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Supreme Court's ruling and congratulate For Women Scotland and others who have campaigned tirelessly on this, despite the abuse, threats and attempts to silence them. Could the Minister please confirm what discussions either the Prime Minister or anyone on the front bench at the time had with Anna Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, when he whipped his MSPs to vote in favour of the SNP's Gender Recognition Reform Bill? And does the Labour front bench now regret some of their previous decisions where they have sided against women across the country, voicing their very real concerns?
Madam Deputy Speaker, where I can agree with the Honourable Lady is that no one should face threats, intimidation or harassment for expressing their views. That is an important principle in our country around freedom of speech, but it should not cross a line. Where it comes to the approach that we take in Scotland, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party has indicated that he welcomes and supports the Supreme Court judgment.
Dawn Butler. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I don't know if anyone else in the House has butch lesbian friends and have been with them when they've been told to get out of women's toilets, but I have. And it is not pleasant and it's not nice. So those people that are using this as a political football, again, should be ashamed of themselves. Madam Deputy Speaker, people didn't understand. If you're saying that trans women have to use men's toilets, and as my honourable friend said, trans men then have to use women's toilets, how are you going to stop them? By asking to see their genitalia? It makes no sense. But does my honourable friend agree with me that the service providers for refugees who provide a vital service for women in desperate need and often use their discretion are now fearful that they can no longer use their discretion when providing services?
Minister. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Supreme Court judgment set out that single-sex spaces are provided on the basis of biological sex, but I do recognise the concern that my honourable friend raises. Lesbians should not be treated in a discriminatory way, and we must ensure that there are toilets and facilities available for everyone within our country. So I just say to her that through the guidance that the EHRC will set out, there will be additional clarity provided in the areas that she has identified.
Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In some ways, the biggest question today is why it took a Supreme Court's decision to confirm this position in the Equalities Act. And I've met with so many. I've heard so much regarding women who are considering to stand as candidates, who are reluctant to do so because of the toxicity in public life. And I think this debate is probably one of the most toxic in terms of misogyny going towards women. I'm lucky, I'm a man, I haven't experienced to the same extent nowhere near what women have experienced. But would she take this moment to reject and to stand up for all women who have campaigned on this issue, reject the abuse and hostility that's put towards them, the importance of their dignity and respect, and thank For Women Scotland for the work they've done taking this forward?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I do recognise the good intentions that the Honourable Gentleman has when he asks that question, but I tell him, like many women in this House, I've experienced that too, and we know what it's like as women to face that kind of abuse, and it is important that whilst we recognise that there can be no place for that kind of abuse of women in public life, we have a responsibility to change that culture, to change that climate, and to encourage women to come forward and stand for elected office.
Tonya Antoniazzi.
Madam Deputy Speaker, since I've been in this House, I have felt the force of the lobby
which has made people and MPs across this House stand there and say that trans women are women. What happened last week was the Supreme Court said that Sex and Equality Act is actually biological sex. That I welcome, Madam Deputy Speaker. But what is the Secretary of State going to do to deal with the types of damage, or the damage that mermaids and Stonewall has caused for a generation? That's 14 years. Under a Tory government, what steps is she going to take to make sure that they rectify the damage they've done to a generation of trans and gender questioning children? Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I recognise my honourable friend's long-standing interest and campaigning in this area. She is right that the Supreme Court judgment provides clarity in terms of biological sex. But I would also say to her, where it comes to support for gender questioning children, where we are talking about children and young people, this has to be about their well-being, because we are often talking about young people who are very vulnerable, who are experiencing real difficulties in their lives. And Hilary Cass's review made clear that young people in that situation do need support, do need protection, and that is why we will this year also publish revised gender questioning guidance for our schools as well, to provide that further clarity that is needed.
Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd firstly like to ask the Secretary of State how we are all going to be asked to prove our birth sex, because as the other honourable member said, this is not just about people who are transgender, non-binary and intersex, but also people who don't conform to gender stereotypes. And I need to share with you my constituents, one who told me, it seems I am going to be ghettoised into trans spaces, and another who said this ruling sends a message that we do not belong, however much we contribute. So what does the Secretary of State suggest I say to those constituents, and will she join me and the Honourable Member for Bournemouth East in meeting Dorset's Space Youth Project for LGBT young people when they visit Parliament next week?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I would say to the Honourable Lady's constituents and trans people across this country that the ruling was clear that whilst single-sex bases are on the basis of biological sex, trans people retain in the law protection from discrimination and harassment, and we as a government will always ensure that trans people have the dignity and respect that they deserve.
Nadia Whittam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Research shows that half of trans people already fear using public toilets. So I am deeply, deeply concerned about the impact of comments by the Minister and the Prime Minister's spokesperson that trans people should use a toilet that many of them would not feel comfortable or safe in. So I ask, how would trans people's exclusion from toilets they have long used be a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim, as the Supreme Court judges and Equality Act dictates? And would the Minister like to clarify that there is nothing in law, in fact, which requires trans women to use men's toilets, or trans men to use women's toilets, or non-binary people to use one corresponding with the sex they were assigned at birth?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Supreme Court's judgment was clear on biological sex, but I do understand and recognise the need to ensure that there is provision, including toilet facilities and other provision in place for everyone within our society. That's why many businesses, many service providers also provide unisex provision, why many service providers will also put in place enclosed bathrooms that do not require people to make that decision, to ensure that their dignity and privacy is respected. That is important for all people in our country, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Luke Evans.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Practical question. Does the ruling apply retrospectively? So if anyone was to have lost their job for their views or won a title in sport, for example, does it apply retrospectively, yes or no?
I think the Honourable Gentleman is referring to employment law cases, and I would have to defer to legal colleagues on that. What the judgment did, however, set out was that it was the Equality Equality Act 2010 that is the basis for single-sex spaces being determined on the basis of biology. They determined that was always the case, had always been the case since 2010, and it was his party that failed to provide that clarity in 14 years.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The unanimous Supreme Court judgment has provided clarity about the application of the Equality Act 2010. And it is incredibly important that hard-earned women's rights and single-sex spaces are protected, while also protecting our trans community who continue to face considerable discrimination. So there needs to be a solution whereby they too are treated with dignity. Does my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, agree that this entire issue needs to be dealt with a great deal of sensitivity and sensibility, rather than it being treated as a political football or as a cultural war issue?
I agree that the Supreme Court judgment provides much needed clarity and certainty, including to service providers, but I also agree with my honourable friend that we need to make sure that this is dealt with sensitivity. I think particularly whereas we have done a number of exchanges in this House that we are talking about children who might be gender questioning, might be experiencing significant issues around their well-being, and I want to make sure that right across society women have the access to single-sex spaces that they need and that they deserve, and that, as he has said, they have long campaigned for, but the trans people too receive appropriate support, including healthcare support, and do not face discrimination or harassment on the basis of who they are.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
While the Supreme Court's ruling brings clarity to some, it brings undeniable...
Happening right now, definition of woman as British minister explains Supreme Court ruling. The UK Supreme Court's ruling affirming that the term woman in the Equity Act refers specifically to biological females has ignited a significant political debate. Prime Minister Keir Starmer welcomed the decision, describing it as a welcome step forward that provides real clarity, and Equities Minister Bridget Phillips also endorsed the ruling, emphasizing the need for safe single-sex spaces for women, particularly survivors of male violence, while affirming that transgender individuals must still have access to appropriate facilities that respect privacy and dignity.